big rivalry was Auburn versus Alabama, or Florida versus Florida State. And in this area of the country, I can remember when I was little, the big rivalry was Nebraska versus Oklahoma. And now since Nebraska's in the Big Ten, they have Nebraska versus Iowa. And if you go back in my history, where I last served in Ohio, wow, there was a big rivalry there. Ohio State versus the team up north. You see, the rivalry is so big that if you're from Ohio, nobody says Michigan. And so there's a big rivalry that takes place. But sometimes I sit there and I wonder, what creates rivalry? What makes it a rivalry? And as I think about it, and as I've read about it, you think about it, it's all competition. And where does the competition between these two come? Think about your life. I think about it from when I was a child. I come from a family where there are 7 of us children in the family. Some people think that's a big family. Other people think, well, that's just getting started. But 7 children. There was a lot of sibling rivalry. We strove at many different times, and I remember this being something that I strove for often. Trying to be better than one of your siblings at something. For a while, I wondered if I was better at anything than they were. And it became competition. And then I'd have competition with my neighbor across the street. He was the same age I was. We used to play catch together. We'd get together, pick up basketball games or baseball games or football games. And we used to compete. And of course, there was always that competition. My dad's better than your dad. And so there was competition. And for him and myself, for me, it went a little further. I started to make it a religious competition. Because, see, he was a Catholic and I was a Lutheran. And whose church is better? And when we got into school, I went to a Lutheran high school. He went to the Catholic high school that was just across town. And that became a big rivalry between those high schools. And when I was in college across town, there was a Baptist college. And there was competition between the Lutheran college and the Baptist college. There was always that competition. And so at the root of all these rivalries is competition. It's separation between 2 different groups. Sometimes that separation becomes quite fierce. And it creates physical battles. It creates battles between the different groups. And I remember reading about the battle between Auburn and Alabama that caused actual physical damage to property on the Auburn campus because of the fans of Alabama. Now it becomes pretty fierce. And whether we believe it or not, sometimes competition and things like that find their way into the church. After all, what is a competition? Is there competition between Lutherans and Catholics and Lutherans and Baptists and all this? Should there be? Or should we as a church not be trying to seek unity? Unity which comes in the faith. And this is what our text is talking about. When Paul is wrapping up his letter, he's dealt with a lot of different things. But one thing that he's really encouraging the people, and I'm encouraging you today to paraphrase what Paul says, I'm saying, let's come together. Let's come together and be united. And I'm not talking about that these church bodies are all going to come into agreement. I'm talking about the holy Christian church, which is united not by church body, but by faith. Paul here, he's dealing with the people at Corinth. And his relationship with the congregation at Corinth, his work with the congregation at Corinth, you could liken it to a roller coaster. Roller coaster. It had its ups and its downs. We look back and we see in 1 Corinthians, Paul dealing with the ups and downs. He was dealing with the problems down in the valleys. Problems that were within that congregation. First of all, there was the issue of it. There was an immoral young man, one who had been seeking and having immoral relations with his mother-in-law, or his stepmother. And this is something Paul needed to address because the congregation wasn't addressing it. The congregation was kind of sweeping it under the rug, acting like it didn't exist. We don't see it, so we don't have to deal with it. So they closed it up and they covered it up. And Paul said, this isn't right. You have to deal with this. And he brought the law to them and showed them how it was wrong. And finally that young man was excommunicated from the church. Kind of a low time in the time of the congregation. Paul addressed it, and later we find that that young man was reinstated because he repented of his sin, and he was granted forgiveness as a repentant sinner would be. The high points of the congregation. And then another low came, in that there were people that were having lawsuits against their other church members. They were having lawsuits. They were suing one another over little petty secular things, and that was binding itself into the church so that there were conflicts within the church. One group would side with one member, one would side with the other member, and all of a sudden there was conflict. Another low point in the congregation. And Paul had to come to them and say, this isn't right. It isn't right because you shouldn't be suing one another. And second of all, look at the image that it gives to the public. Paul says, we cannot have this. Things were remedied and came to a high point again. And that congregation was united. And then, just as that things are at the peak, some people started abusing the Lord's Supper. The real importance of the Lord's Supper wasn't important to them again. They were taking it just like any other meal, like eating bread and drinking wine. It was just an everyday thing. And it had lost its importance, its value in their minds and in their lives. And Paul said, this can't be. This is the body and blood of Christ. They were at a low point. Paul brought to them God's word and restored the high point again. And that's what happens when he addresses them in the first letter. And things seem to flow along pretty well until other people said, hey, maybe this sounds familiar in the last week. People come in from the outside and start to just create problems in the congregation. They did that. They came in from outside and they introduced problems within the congregation to get the congregation in turmoil, to stir them up, to cause trouble. And the trouble specifically that came at the beginning of 2 Corinthians that Paul was addressing was people were questioning, who is this Paul? And they dug up dirt about Paul. And it wasn't very hard to find dirt on Paul. Remember who he used to be. He used to be Saul. He was the one that was persecuting Christians, putting people to death for their faith. And now he's standing in front of those same Christians and preaching Jesus Christ crucified and risen for their salvation. They're going, wait a minute. Who is this Paul that we should listen to him? Isn't that